On a lonely street, a 90-year-old blind man stumbled through the rain, his cane tapping against the wet ground. His frail hands stretched out, shaking, as he begged for someone, anyone, to help him. The cold bit into his skin as the rain drenched him from head to toe. His voice cracked as he called out, "Help me, please." But no one answered. Suddenly, something changed. Footsteps splashed through the puddles behind him, and a deep, unfamiliar voice spoke. The man's heart raced. Was it a friend, or something far more dangerous? What do you think this blind man, weak and alone, will do when faced with what comes next? Keep watching to find out, because you're about to be shocked. What you think will happen won't happen at all. The night sky roared with thunder, and the rain came down like a waterfall. James, a 90-year-old man who had lost his sight many years ago, found himself alone. His cane tapped along the sidewalk as he struggled to find his way home. He had ventured out earlier in the day when the sun was still shining, but the weather had changed without warning, and now he was lost, cold, and soaked. He knew this part of town. At least he thought he did. But it was different when you couldn't see. The streets felt longer, the sidewalks rougher, and every sound was louder. The rain pounding against the ground was so loud it drowned out the soft taps of his cane. James coughed, pulling his thin coat tighter around him. His bones ached, his feet were sore, and his heart pounded in his chest. "Is anyone there?" He called out, but the wind stole his words. He stumbled forward, his foot catching on something uneven on the ground, and he fell hard. His hands hit the cold, wet pavement, scraping his skin. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Please help me." Then he heard it. Footsteps. They were slow at first, almost hidden by the rain, but they were there. His heart leaped in his chest. Someone had heard him. He wasn't alone. But as the steps grew closer, a strange feeling crept over him. The person didn't call out, didn't rush to his side. The footsteps were steady, almost deliberate, as if whoever it was didn't care how badly James needed help. "Hello," James called out again, his voice shaking. "I've fallen. I need help." No response. The footsteps stopped. James held his breath, listening as hard as he could. He couldn't see, but he could feel the presence of someone standing near him. It felt heavy, as if the air around him had thickened. He tried to push himself up, but his hand slipped on the wet ground, and he fell back down. Then, finally, the voice spoke. "Do you really need help?" James froze. There was something strange about the voice. It was low, almost like a growl, but it wasn't angry. No, it sounded calm, too calm for the situation. "Yes," James stammered, his breath quickening. "I've fallen, and I can't get up. I'm blind, and I don't know where I am." The voice chuckled softly. It was a sound that sent chills up James' spine. "I know," the voice said. James' heart thudded in his chest. What did this person mean by that? How did they know? He was trembling now, not from the cold but from fear. He could sense the person getting closer, could feel their presence looming over him. Whoever it was, they weren't here to help. He knew that now. "What do you want?" James asked, his voice barely a whisper. The rain continued to pour down, drenching them both, but neither moved. The silence stretched between them, and then, without warning, James felt a hand grab his arm. Tight, firm, almost painfully so. He gasped, his body tensing. "Let me go," he shouted, trying to pull away, but the grip only tightened. The voice leaned in close, so close that James could feel their breath on his face. "You're coming with me," the voice said quietly. And then, just as quickly as they had appeared, the person yanked James up onto his feet, dragging him through the rain-soaked streets. James struggled, his old body no match for the strength of his captor. "Where are you taking me?" James cried out, panic rising in his throat. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. Why would someone do this? Who were they? The person didn't answer. Instead, they kept pulling him forward, their grip like iron. James tried to resist, but his legs were weak, and his head spun from the fear and exhaustion. They walked for what felt like hours, but it was probably only minutes. The sound of the rain faded into the background, replaced by the beating of James' own heart. He was terrified, lost, and completely at the mercy of this stranger. Then, Just as suddenly as they had started walking, the person stopped. James stumbled but managed to keep his footing this time. He felt the grip on his arm loosen slightly, but the hand remained firmly in place. "Here," the voice said. "We're here." James swallowed hard. Where is here? The rain had let up a little, but the air was still thick with moisture. The sound of water dripping from rooftops filled the silence, and James could hear the faint rumble of thunder in the distance. "You'll see," the voice said with a soft chuckle. James' stomach dropped. What did they mean by that? He was blind. He couldn't see anything. Suddenly, without warning, the person released him. James stumbled back, his feet slipping on the wet ground, but he didn't fall. He stood there, breathing heavily, his heart pounding in his chest. He was free. Or so he thought. The ground beneath his feet shifted, and before James could react, the earth gave way. He fell, tumbling down into the darkness, the wind rushing past him as he plummeted into the unknown. James felt as if the world had vanished. The rain was replaced by a thick darkness, and the sound of thunder faded away, leaving only a deafening silence. He had no idea how far he had fallen or where he was going. Panic gripped him, and he flailed his arms, desperately trying to grab onto something, anything, to stop his fall. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he landed with a thud. Pain shot through his back and legs, but he didn't have time to think about that. He lay still for a moment, taking shallow breaths, listening for any sign of life around him. "Hello," he called out, his voice trembling. "Is anyone there?" No response. James slowly pushed himself up, wincing at the ache in his bones. His hands felt the cold, damp ground beneath him, which was surprisingly solid. As he sat up, he noticed the air was different here, cooler and heavier, almost like being inside a cave. Cautiously, he reached out with his hands, exploring his surroundings. The ground was hard and rocky, with bits of earth and small stones beneath his fingers. He pushed himself to stand, swaying slightly as dizziness washed over him. "Where am I?" he whispered, confusion swirling in his mind. What happened? Suddenly, he heard a faint sound, like water dripping. It echoed in the silence, each drop resonating around him. With nothing else to guide him, James took a cautious step forward, his cane tapping against the ground. He could feel walls on either side of him, rough and uneven, like a narrow passageway. As he walked, his heart raced. What if he was trapped down here? What if he was all alone? His thoughts spiraled, each step making the darkness feel heavier. But then he remembered the stranger, the voice. They had taken him here for a reason. But what was that reason? Suddenly, James heard something different, a rustling sound, followed by soft, hesitant footsteps. His heart leaped in his chest. Maybe he wasn't alone after all. "Hello," he called out again, a little louder this time. "Is someone there?" "Sha," a voice hissed, and James froze. It was low and cautious. "You need to be quiet." James's heart raced again. "Why? Who are you?" The footsteps drew closer, and soon a figure appeared beside him. It was a girl, no older than 16, with dark hair that clung to her face. She was soaked from the rain, just like him, but she seemed calm. "I'm Emma," she said quickly. "You're safe here, but you have to keep your voice down. They might hear us." "Who might hear us?" James asked, confusion twisting in his stomach. "What is going on?" Emma leaned in closer, her eyes wide with fear. "The people who brought you here. They don't want us to escape." James took a step back, trying to process what she had just said. "Escape? Where are we?" Emma glanced around nervously before responding. "I don't know exactly. I was caught in the storm too. And then someone grabbed me and brought me here. I heard them talking about something. Something bad." James shivered, a chill running down his spine. "What do you mean bad?" She hesitated, biting her lip. "They were saying something about a plan, and that they needed us. But I don't know what for." James's mind raced. What do we do? How do we get out of here? Emma frowned, her brow furrowed in thought. "I don't know. I've been trying to find a way, but it's so dark. We could try to find an exit, but what?" James urged. She took a deep breath. "But I don't think they'll let us go easily. They were talking about keeping us here until they get what they want." "What do they want?" James asked, panic creeping back in. I don't know, but they don't seem like good people, Emma replied, her voice shaking. James's heart raced at the thought of being held captive. He needed to stay strong. He had lived through so much in his life, and he couldn't give up now. We have to find a way out of here, together. Emma nodded, her eyes filled with determination. Yes, together. Just then, they heard a loud crash from somewhere in the distance, followed by muffled voices echoing through the passageway. James's heart dropped. Hide, Emma whispered urgently. They both crouched low against the wall, their hearts pounding in their chests as the voices grew closer. James held his breath, straining to hear what they were saying. Did you find the old man? A voice growled. No, I think he fell into the pit, another voice replied. But we can't let anyone see him. If they find him, everything is ruined. James's mind spun. What did they mean by everything is ruined? Let's search this area again, the first voice said. We can't let anyone escape. No one must know about this place. James felt a surge of fear. They were talking about him and Emma. Are you okay? Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. James nodded, but he felt a pit in his stomach. If they were going to find a way out, they had to move fast. As the footsteps drew closer, James grabbed Emma's arm. We have to go now, he urged. Follow me. They crept silently along the wall, moving as quietly as possible, their hearts racing. The sound of the voices faded slightly as they turned a corner, and James hoped they had escaped. But as they moved deeper into the dark passageway, they soon realized they weren't in a simple cave. The walls felt too smooth, and the ground was strangely solid. Where are we? Emma whispered, glancing around nervously. I don't know, but we need to keep going, James replied, determination growing inside him. We have to find an exit. Just then, they stumbled upon a heavy wooden door, slightly ajar. A sliver of light spilled through the crack, illuminating the darkness around them. Do you think we should go in? Emma asked, her eyes wide with uncertainty. James hesitated. We don't know what's on the other side, but we can't stay here. Gathering his courage, he reached out and pushed the door open, wincing as it creaked loudly. The light poured in, and they stepped into a room filled with strange machinery and maps scattered across tables. Look at all this, Emma exclaimed, her eyes wide with wonder. James's heart raced as he surveyed the room. This must be their base, he said, his voice low. But we have to be careful. We could be caught at any moment. Just then, the door swung open, and in walked the same man who had grabbed James earlier, along with two others. They were all drenched but looked unfazed, their eyes scanning the room. Quick, James hissed. Hide. They ducked behind a table, holding their breath as the men began to speak. Where did they go? The leader growled, looking around. They can't be far. Search everywhere. James felt his heart drop. They were searching for him and Emma. We have to get out of here, he whispered urgently. Emma nodded, her face pale with fear. But where do we go? There's nowhere to hide. James glanced around the room, his mind racing. He needed a plan. Look for another exit. There has to be another way out. Just then, they heard footsteps approaching from the other side of the room. James felt his chest tighten. They had to move fast. Over here. Emma pointed to a door at the far end of the room, half hidden behind a stack of crates. Let's go, James urged. They dashed toward the door, adrenaline pumping through their veins. As they reached for the handle, they heard a shout behind them. Stop right there. James's heart raced. They had been spotted. Run, James shouted, bursting through the door just as the shout echoed in the room behind them. The space beyond was dimly lit, filled with heavy machinery and strange equipment. He could hear the men's footsteps pounding behind him, their shouts growing louder. James grabbed Emma's hand, pulling her forward as they darted through the narrow corridor. It felt like a maze, twisting and turning, with no clear way out. The walls were cold and hard, the air thick with tension. Each step felt like a race against time, a battle to escape the unknown danger behind them. Where do we go? Emma gasped, glancing back over her shoulder, her face pale with fear. I don't know. Just keep running, James replied, determination fueling his every step. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through him, pushing him forward despite the ache in his bones. As they rounded a corner, they skidded to a halt in front of a massive metal door, locked tight. James pressed his ear against it, listening for any sign of their pursuers. The shouting had stopped, but he could still hear their footsteps echoing faintly in the distance. "Is it locked?" Emma asked, her voice trembling. James turned the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "It's locked," he said, frustration rising in his chest. "We can't stay here. We need to find another way." He looked around, desperately searching for any other exits. The corridor stretched ahead of them, dimly lit by flickering overhead lights. Just as he was about to suggest going back, Emma tugged at his sleeve. "Look," she said, pointing to a small window near the ceiling. James squinted in the dim light. It was a narrow window, but it might be just big enough to squeeze through. "Can you reach it?" he asked, hope blossoming in his chest. "I can try," Emma said, her eyes brightening. "Let me give you a boost," James offered. He knelt down, and Emma placed her hands on his shoulders as she climbed onto his back. With a push, he helped her reach the window. "Almost there," Emma said, stretching her fingers toward the edge. Suddenly, James heard the door behind them rattling. They were running out of time. "Hurry," he urged. Emma pushed herself up, finally grabbing the ledge. "I think I can make it," she called down, but just as she said that, the door swung open, and the men came rushing in. "Get them," the leader shouted. "Jump," James shouted, watching as Emma managed to pull herself through the window, her legs kicking to find a foothold on the other side. James felt a rush of panic. There was no way he could climb through the window in time, but he couldn't leave Emma behind. He had to buy her some time. With a deep breath, he turned to face the men. "You'll have to go through me first," he yelled, trying to sound braver than he felt. "Get him," the leader snarled, lunging toward James. James braced himself, preparing for the impact. He was an old man. He couldn't fight them, but he could stall them. As the first man lunged at him, James dodged to the side, using his cane to trip the man up. "Go," he shouted to Emma, who was struggling to get a grip on the window ledge. But she didn't move. "James," she cried, watching helplessly as the men closed in. Just as one of them grabbed James's arm, he twisted away, swinging his cane hard against the man's leg. The man stumbled, but another one charged forward, tackling James to the ground. James fought against the weight of the man on top of him, but he felt his strength slipping. He couldn't hold them off for long. He could hear Emma's cries fading behind him, and he felt a wave of desperation wash over him. "Help," Emma screamed. "Just go," James shouted back, feeling the pressure of the men's grip tighten around him. "I'll be okay." But Emma didn't move. Instead, she pulled herself back through the window, dropping to the ground beside him. "I won't leave you," she said fiercely. The men paused, momentarily stunned by Emma's bravery. In that split second, James felt a surge of hope. "If we can just get to the door," he thought. "Together," James yelled, summoning every bit of strength he had left. Emma nodded, determination shining in her eyes. They both pushed against the weight of the men holding James down. With a grunt, they managed to shove the man off him, scrambling to their feet. "Run for the door," James shouted, his heart pounding. They bolted toward the metal door, hearts racing, as they heard the men behind them regaining their balance. "Faster," Emma urged, and they reached the door, desperately trying to turn the handle. James felt a sharp pain shoot through his arm as one of the men grabbed him from behind, but he twisted free, slamming his body against the door. "It won't open," he cried out. "Use the cane," Emma shouted, pointing to the latch. "Break it." James hesitated, but there was no time to waste. He swung his cane hard against the latch, adrenaline driving him forward. With a loud crack, the latch broke free, and the door swung open. They stumbled through, barely escaping the grasp of their captors. The cold night air hit them like a wave, refreshing but dangerous. "Keep moving," James shouted, leading Emma into the darkness outside. The rain had slowed to a light drizzle, the storm still rumbling in the distance. They dashed down a narrow alley, panting heavily, their hearts pounding in their chests. "Where do we go now?" Emma asked, looking around anxiously. James paused to catch his breath, glancing over his shoulder to make sure they weren't being followed. We need to find somewhere safe, somewhere we can hide until the storm passes. Emma nodded, her eyes scanning the streets. There's a park nearby. If we can make it there, we might find shelter. Let's go, James said, taking off again. They ran through the rain-slicked streets, desperate to put as much distance between them and their pursuers as possible. As they reached the park, James felt a sense of relief wash over him. The trees provided a canopy against the rain, offering a moment of cover. They ducked behind a thick bush, catching their breath. Do you think they'll find us? Emma whispered, glancing around nervously. I don't know, James admitted, but we have to stay quiet and keep our eyes open. If they're looking for us, we have to be ready. Just then, a flash of light illuminated the park, a flashlight sweeping through the trees. James's heart raced as the beam drew closer. Get down, he hissed, pushing Emma down behind the bush. They huddled together, holding their breath as the footsteps approached. Where are they? A voice called out, cutting through the darkness. James gripped his cane tightly, his heart pounding. They were so close. Could they escape again? Suddenly, the flashlight beam swung directly toward their hiding spot, illuminating the bush just inches from where they were crouched. James felt a wave of panic, knowing they had been found. Over there, a man shouted. They sprang to their feet, adrenaline surging through them as they dashed deeper into the park. Split up, James yelled, making a quick decision. It'll confuse them. No, Emma protested, fear in her eyes. We have to stick together. Trust me, James shouted back. I'll meet you at the big tree in the middle. Without waiting for a response, he turned and ran, pushing himself as fast as he could. The rain fell harder now, mixing with the pounding of his heart. He could hear the men shouting behind him, but he didn't look back. He focused on the path ahead, searching for that big tree he had seen on his way in. As he reached the center of the park, he spotted it, an enormous oak, its branches stretching wide. He ran toward it, his breath coming in ragged gasps, praying Emma would be safe. He ducked behind the tree, pressing himself against the trunk, his heart racing. He could hear the men coming closer, their voices echoing in the night. Where did they go? One of them shouted. James felt a wave of fear wash over him. Had Emma made it? Would she be safe? Just then, he heard a familiar voice, Emma's voice, coming from somewhere nearby. James. He couldn't help the smile that broke across his face. I'm here, he called out softly. Over here, she said, rushing toward him, her eyes wide with relief. They huddled together behind the tree, breathing heavily, listening as the men continued their search. Do you think they'll find us? Emma whispered, her voice trembling. James shook his head, trying to stay strong for her. Not if we stay quiet. But just as he said that, they heard footsteps coming from the other side of the tree. James's heart sank. We have to move, he urged, grabbing Emma's hand. They slipped away from the tree, trying to stay as quiet as possible, but the men were getting closer. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the park, followed by a shout. Over there, one of the men yelled. James and Emma froze, fear gripping them as they exchanged wide-eyed glances. They were running out of time. Let's go, James whispered, pulling Emma away from the noise. They dashed toward a small path leading out of the park, their hearts pounding in their chests. As they sprinted forward, they could hear the men shouting behind them, their footsteps growing louder. Don't stop, James urged, pushing Emma to keep moving. We have to find a way out. But just as they reached the end of the path, they stumbled upon a fence blocking their way. James's heart sank. They had nowhere to go. Climb, Emma shouted, scrambling to find a foothold. James didn't hesitate, quickly following her lead. They both clambered up the fence, their fingers grasping the rough wood as they pulled themselves higher. Almost there, Emma urged, her voice strained with effort. Just as they reached the top, James heard the men closing in behind them, their shouts echoing in the night. Hurry, he yelled, pushing himself over the edge. He landed hard on the other side, wincing as pain shot through his legs. James, Emma cried out, her voice filled with urgency. Come on. He turned just in time to see her slip off the fence, landing beside him with a soft thud. Let's go, he urged, grabbing her hand as they sprinted away, adrenaline fueling their escape. But as they ran, James couldn't shake the feeling that danger was still lurking just behind them. The storm had calmed, but their fight was far from over. With the men still in pursuit, they dashed down the street, desperately searching for a safe place to hide. Suddenly, James spotted a small shop with its lights still on, a glimmer of hope in the dark. "In there," he shouted, pointing toward the shop. Emma nodded, and they sprinted toward it, their hearts racing. Just as they reached the door, they heard the sound of footsteps behind them, drawing closer. "Now," James yelled, pushing the door open and pulling Emma inside. They ducked down, pressing themselves against the wall as they listened for any signs of their pursuers. "What do we do now?" Emma whispered, her eyes wide with fear. James took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. "We wait and hope they don't find us," he replied, scanning the shop for a place to hide. They crouched behind a shelf, the sound of their hearts pounding echoing in the silence. "Do you think they'll come in?" Emma asked, biting her lip. "I don't know," James admitted, his mind racing. "But we have to stay quiet." Suddenly, they heard the door open, and heavy footsteps echoed in the shop. James felt a wave of panic wash over him as they held their breath, the tension thick in the air. "Where are they?" a voice growled, searching the shop. James's heart raced. They were right outside their hiding spot. He glanced at Emma, their eyes meeting in a moment of shared fear. But just as he thought they were done for, the sound of another voice interrupted the search. "We need to check the back," it said. James's heart raced with hope. If they moved fast, they might have a chance to escape out the back door. "Now," he whispered urgently to Emma. They carefully crept out from behind the shelf, their eyes darting around the shop as they moved toward the back. Just as they reached the door, they heard the men coming closer, their voices growing louder. "Quick," James urged, pushing the door open. They slipped through the door and found themselves in a narrow alley, the rain now just a light drizzle. "Where do we go?" Emma asked, looking around anxiously. James scanned the alley, searching for an escape. "There." He pointed to a gap between two buildings. "We can go that way." They dashed down the alley, their hearts pounding as they turned the corner. The sounds of the men faded into the distance, and for a moment, they felt safe. "Did we lose them?" Emma asked, catching her breath. "I think so," James replied, but the worry still gnawed at him. They continued down the alley, their feet splashing through puddles as they navigated the narrow space between the buildings. "Where are we going?" Emma asked, glancing back over her shoulder. "Anywhere but here," James said, determination filling his voice. "We'll find a safe place." As they emerged from the alley, they found themselves on a quiet street, the rain now easing to a light mist. James felt a wave of relief wash over him, but he knew they couldn't let their guard down just yet. "Let's keep moving," he urged, taking Emma's hand as they walked down the street. They passed closed shops and darkened houses, the quiet of the night wrapping around them like a blanket. "Do you think they'll give up?" Emma asked softly, looking up at James with worry in her eyes. James sighed, trying to stay hopeful. "They might, but we can't take that chance." Just then, they heard a distant sound, footsteps approaching from behind them. "Run," James shouted, adrenaline pumping through him again. They took off down the street, their hearts racing as they heard the footsteps getting closer. "Where do we go?" Emma cried, her voice filled with panic. "Anywhere," James urged, his mind racing for a plan. Suddenly, he spotted a small park up ahead, its trees providing cover. "There," he shouted, pointing toward it. They sprinted toward the park, the sound of their pursuers echoing behind them. James felt a surge of determination. They couldn't let them catch them now. As they entered the park, the trees surrounded them, providing a sense of safety. James and Emma ducked behind a thick trunk, catching their breath as they listened for the footsteps. "Do you think they saw us?" Emma whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," James replied, his heart pounding. "But we have to stay quiet." They huddled together, their hearts racing as the sounds of footsteps faded into the distance. Just as they thought they were safe, James heard a rustling sound from the bushes nearby. His heart dropped. "Stay still," he hissed of Emma, gripping her arm tightly. But before they could react, a figure emerged from the bushes. an old man with wild hair and a beard, looking just as frightened as they were. "Who are you?" James demanded, ready to defend Emma. The old man raised his hands in surrender. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, his voice shaky. "I'm hiding from them too." "From who?" Emma asked, glancing nervously at James. "The men who took me," the old man explained, his eyes wide with fear. "They're dangerous. You shouldn't be out here." James's heart raced as he exchanged glances with Emma. They weren't the only ones. "What do you mean?" James asked, curiosity mingling with fear. "They're after something," the old man said, lowering his voice. "Something very important. You need to be careful." James's mind raced with questions. What do they want? The old man shook his head. "I don't know, but they'll stop at nothing to get it." Suddenly, they heard the sound of footsteps approaching again, and James felt panic rise within him. "Quick," he urged, pulling Emma and the old man deeper into the shadows. "We have to hide." They ducked behind a thick bush just as the men entered the park, their voices loud and demanding. "They went this way," one of them shouted, their flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. James held his breath, pressing against the old man and Emma as they listened to the men search the area. Where could they have gone? Another voice growled. James felt his heart race as he gripped his cane tightly, ready to defend Emma and himself if necessary. "We need to split up," the leader said, his voice echoing in the night. "We'll find them. They can't hide forever." James's stomach churned at the thought of being discovered. He needed a plan, something to keep them safe. "Stay quiet," he whispered to Emma and the old man, his eyes focused on the men as they drew closer. Suddenly, one of the men turned their flashlight toward their hiding spot. James felt a rush of fear as the beam illuminated the bush. "Over there," the man shouted, pointing toward them. "Run," James yelled, pushing Emma and the old man away from the bush. They bolted deeper into the park, adrenaline pumping through their veins as they sprinted away from the men. "Where do we go?" Emma cried, her voice filled with panic. "Just keep moving," James shouted, determination surging through him. "We can't let them catch us." As they ran, James's mind raced with possibilities. They needed to find a way to outsmart their captors, to turn the tables before it was too late. But the men were fast, and he could hear their footsteps pounding behind them. "Keep going," he urged, glancing back at Emma and the old man, who were struggling to keep up. Suddenly, James spotted a small shed at the edge of the park. "In there," he shouted, pointing toward it. They dashed toward the shed, slipping inside just as the men turned the corner. "Close the door," James urged, holding it shut as they huddled inside. Emma and the old man leaned against the door, their hearts racing, as they listened to the footsteps approaching outside. "What now?" Emma asked, her voice trembling. James took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "We wait and hope they don't find us." But just then, he heard a voice from outside, the leader of the men. "They must be in here." James's heart dropped. They had to find a way to escape, and fast. "Let's find another exit," he whispered urgently, glancing around the dimly lit shed. There was a small window near the back, but it was too high for them to reach. "Can you lift me?" Emma asked, determination in her eyes. James nodded, feeling a surge of hope. "I'll boost you up." They worked together, and with one final push, Emma managed to get her arms through the window. "I see a way out," she called down, her voice filled with excitement. James felt a rush of relief. "Can you get through?" "I think so," Emma replied, wiggling her body as she squeezed through. Just as James heard the door rattling, he pushed Emma up, urging her to keep going. "Come on," he shouted, panic rising within him. With one final effort, Emma pulled herself through the window, landing safely outside. "Now you," she urged, glancing back at James. He turned just in time to see the door burst open, the men rushing in. "Get him," the leader shouted, pointing directly at James. Without thinking, James launched himself at the window, desperate to escape. He felt the men grabbing at him, their hands reaching for his clothes as he squeezed through the narrow opening. "James," Emma cried, grabbing his arm as he tumbled out of the window. With a hard thud, he landed on the ground beside her, both of them gasping for breath. "Run," James shouted, pulling Emma to her feet. They took off again, sprinting away from the shed, as the men yelled in anger behind them. "Where do we go now?" Emma asked, her eyes wide with fear. "Anywhere," James shouted, scanning the street for a safe place to hide. Suddenly, he spotted an alleyway nearby. "That way," he pointed, leading Emma toward it. They dashed into the alley, their hearts racing as they pressed against the cold brick walls, trying to catch their breath. James felt a rush of panic as he glanced back. "We can't stop now. We need to keep moving." They stumbled down the alley, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the stillness. Just when they thought they were safe, they heard the sound of footsteps behind them again. This time, they were closer than ever. "Don't look back," James urged, pushing Emma forward. They ran faster, their legs aching as they sprinted down the narrow passage. But as they reached the end of the alley, they found themselves facing a dead end, a tall brick wall blocking their path. "Now what?" Emma asked, panic rising in her voice. James's heart raced. They were trapped, with nowhere to go. "Climb," he shouted, pointing to a stack of crates nearby. Without hesitation, they scrambled up the crates, trying to reach the top of the wall. "Come on," James urged, pulling Emma up beside him. Just as they reached the top, they heard the men entering the alley behind them. "They're here," Emma gasped, her eyes wide with fear. James glanced back, heart pounding. "We have to jump." Without waiting for a response, he leaped off the wall, landing hard on the other side. Emma followed, and they both hit the ground running. "Keep going," James shouted, leading them into the darkness. But as they dashed down the street, they realized they were back where they started, near the park. "Where do we go?" Emma cried, looking around in confusion. James's mind raced, searching for an answer, but the men were close behind them, their shouts echoing in the night. "Let's hide in the bushes," James urged, pointing toward a thick patch of greenery nearby. They ducked down, pressing themselves into the shadows as they listened for the men. "Where did they go?" One of them shouted, their voices growing closer. James felt his heart race, knowing they were running out of time. "We can't stay here," Emma whispered urgently. "Just a little longer," James replied, trying to stay calm. But as they huddled together, the sound of footsteps stopped just outside their hiding spot. "Search the bushes," the leader ordered. James held his breath, fear coursing through him as he gripped Emma's hand tightly. Just then, he heard the sound of a flashlight beam flickering nearby. "There they are," one of the men shouted, pointing directly at them. "Run," James yelled, pushing Emma forward as they scrambled out of the bushes. They took off down the street, desperation fueling their flight. James felt a surge of energy as they dashed away from the men, their footsteps echoing behind them. "Where do we go?" Emma cried, glancing back. "Anywhere," James shouted, but he could feel panic rising within him again. Suddenly, they spotted a small diner, its neon lights flickering in the darkness. "In there," James shouted, pointing toward it. They sprinted toward the diner, praying it would provide some kind of refuge. Just as they reached the door, they heard the men shouting behind them. "Get them," the leader yelled. James pushed the door open, and they stumbled inside, gasping for breath. The diner was mostly empty, a few late-night customers sitting at the counter. James glanced back at the door, his heart racing. "We need to find a place to hide." Emma nodded, looking around the diner for somewhere safe. "Over there." She pointed to a small storage room at the back. They hurried toward it, ducking inside just as the door swung open behind them. The men rushed into the diner, their voices loud and angry. "Where did they go?" one of them shouted, scanning the room. James and Emma held their breath, pressing themselves against the wall as they listened. "Check the back," the leader ordered. James felt a wave of panic wash over him. They couldn't be found now, not when they were so close to escaping. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps approached the storage room. "Here," one of the men shouted, pushing the door open. "Get them," the leader yelled. In a moment of desperation, James grabbed a box from the shelf and threw it at the men, hoping to buy them some time. "Run," he shouted to Emma, pushing her toward the exit. They bolted out of the storage room, dashing back into the diner just as the men stumbled inside. "Get them," the leader yelled, their voices echoing in the small space. James felt a surge of determination as he and Emma ran toward the door. But as they reached it, they were met with a wall of men blocking their escape. Nowhere to run, the leader sneered. James's heart raced as he looked around, searching for a way out. But just then, the diner door burst open, and a group of customers rushed in, panic etched on their faces. "Get out," one of them shouted. "They're coming." James felt a rush of hope as chaos erupted in the diner. "Go," he urged Emma, pushing her toward the back exit. They darted through the crowd, dodging tables and chairs as they made their way to safety. "Where do we go now?" Emma asked, her voice filled with fear. "Anywhere," James shouted, determination filling his chest. They dashed out the back door, escaping into the cool night air. "Keep running," James yelled, leading Emma away from the diner and into the darkness. But as they ran, they could hear the men shouting behind them, their footsteps pounding on the pavement. "Don't look back," James urged, pushing Emma forward. They raced down the street, their hearts pounding as they searched for a place to hide. Suddenly, they spotted a small park nearby. "In there," James pointed, leading Emma toward it. As they entered the park, they ducked behind a large tree, gasping for breath. "Do you think they'll find us?" Emma asked, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't know," James replied, trying to stay calm. "But we have to be ready." They huddled together, listening as the sounds of their pursuers faded into the distance. But just when they thought they were safe, they heard the sound of footsteps approaching from the other side of the tree. James's heart raced as he gripped his cane tightly. "Stay still," he hissed to Emma. Suddenly, a figure stepped out from behind the tree, a woman with wild hair and a determined look in her eyes. "Who are you?" James demanded, ready to defend Emma. "I'm here to help," the woman said, her voice urgent. "I know what they want. You need to come with me." James exchanged a glance with Emma, unsure of what to do. But just then, the sound of footsteps grew closer, and the woman gestured for them to follow her. "Now," she urged, leading them deeper into the park. They sprinted after her, desperate for safety. As they ducked behind another tree, the woman explained, "They're after a hidden treasure, something powerful. You can't let them catch you." James felt a surge of determination. They had to find a way to stop these men, to protect whatever it was they were after. "What do we do?" Emma asked, glancing back toward the sounds of their pursuers. The woman looked around, her eyes scanning the area. "We need to find a place to hide and come up with a plan." James nodded, his mind racing with possibilities. "Follow me," the woman said, leading them toward a hidden path through the trees. They crept quietly through the park, the sounds of their pursuers fading behind them. Finally, they reached a small clearing surrounded by dense trees. "This will do," the woman said, looking around. "We can lay low here for a while." James felt a wave of relief wash over him as they settled into their hiding spot. But he knew their fight was far from over. "What's your name?" James asked the woman. "I'm Sarah," she replied, her eyes focused. "And I know how to stop them." James felt a surge of hope. They weren't alone anymore. "What do we do?" Emma asked, her voice steadying. Sarah glanced around the clearing, a determined look on her face. "We need to come up with a plan to outsmart them. We can't let them take the treasure." James nodded, his heart racing with anticipation. They had a chance to fight back, to protect whatever it was that the men were after. "Let's do it," he said, determination filling his voice. And as they huddled together, they began to formulate a plan, a way to turn the tables on their pursuers and protect the treasure that could change everything. James, Emma, and Sarah huddled together in the clearing, their breaths still heavy from their escape. The night was silent except for the rustling of leaves and the distant sounds of the city. They had a moment to gather their thoughts, but urgency filled the air. "What treasure are they after?" James asked, his curiosity piqued. Sarah leaned in closer, her voice low and serious. "It's a necklace, a very special one. It has the power to reveal truths and secrets. The men are part of a gang that wants it for their own gain." James's eyes widened. "A necklace. What makes it so powerful?" "It belonged to an ancient queen," Sarah explained. "Legends say it can show the true nature of anyone who wears it. If they get their hands on it, they could manipulate people into doing anything they want." Emma gasped. "We have to stop them." James nodded, feeling a sense of determination wash over him. But how? They're bigger and stronger than us. Sarah straightened up, her expression fierce. That's why we need a plan. We can't confront them directly. We need to outsmart them. James felt a rush of hope as he listened to her. What do you have in mind? We'll set a trap, Sarah said, her eyes sparkling with excitement. We'll use the park to our advantage. There are hidden paths and places they won't expect us to go. Emma leaned in closer. What do we need to do? First, we need to gather some supplies, Sarah said, looking around the clearing. If we're going to outsmart them, we need tools. I saw a couple of benches nearby. We might be able to use those to our advantage. James looked at Emma, her eyes filled with determination. Let's do it, he said. As they moved quietly through the park, they picked up items they could use. A few branches, an old piece of rope, and some discarded cardboard. They returned to the clearing, their spirits lifting as they gathered their supplies. Now we need to create some distractions, Sarah said, her mind racing with ideas. If we can lead them away from the necklace, we can get a chance to hide it somewhere safe. James furrowed his brow, thinking hard. What if we made noise on one side of the park and then hid the necklace on the other? Yes, Sarah exclaimed. That could work. We can make it sound like we're there, but then we'll be somewhere else. Emma smiled, feeling a sense of excitement. Let's do it. They spent the next hour working together, setting up their distractions. They used the rope to tie branches to the benches, creating makeshift alarms that would sound if someone got too close. As they worked, James felt the adrenaline pumping through his veins. He had never been part of something like this before. It felt like an adventure, and for the first time in a while, he felt alive. Once they finished setting everything up, Sarah turned to them. Okay, it's time to find that necklace. We have to be quick. James nodded, feeling a rush of determination. Let's go. They crept quietly through the park, careful to avoid any paths that might lead them back to the men. As they moved deeper into the shadows, they reached a large oak tree with a hollow trunk. This is the perfect spot to hide it, Sarah whispered, her eyes shining. James took the necklace out of his pocket, feeling its cool metal against his skin. This is it, he said, glancing at Emma and Sarah. With a steady hand, he placed the necklace inside the hollow trunk, concealing it from sight. Now let's set the distractions, Sarah said, looking around. I'll make some noise over by the benches. Emma and I will wait here, James replied, feeling his heart race with excitement. As Sarah moved away, James turned to Emma. Are you ready for this? Emma nodded, her eyes wide with anticipation. I can't believe we're doing this. Just stay quiet and follow my lead, James instructed, feeling a sense of responsibility for her safety. They waited in silence, listening as Sarah began to make noise at the benches, banging the rope against the wood to create a ruckus. Come on, James muttered under his breath, urging their plan to unfold. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed through the park, and James felt a rush of fear. Do you hear that? Emma whispered, her voice trembling. James nodded, peeking out from behind the tree. He could see the men approaching, their faces angry and determined. There they are, one of them shouted, pointing toward the noise. Let's go, James urged, grabbing Emma's hand as they moved quietly away from the tree. As they crept deeper into the park, they could hear the men shouting at each other, confused by the noise. Did you see where they went? The leader shouted, frustration lacing his voice. No, but they have to be around here somewhere. James felt a surge of excitement as they slipped further into the shadows. They were getting away. But just then, they heard a loud crash from the benches, followed by an angry shout. What was that? The leader yelled. Check it out. Oh no, Emma whispered, her eyes wide with fear. They're coming, James urged, pulling her closer as they ducked behind another tree. The footsteps grew louder, and James could see the men moving through the park, searching for them. Quick, we have to find a new hiding spot. They darted behind a nearby bush, their hearts racing as they pressed against the cool leaves. Where's Sarah? Emma asked, worry creeping into her voice. She'll be fine, James assured her, though he felt a knot of anxiety in his stomach. As they waited, they listened to the men growing closer, their voices filled with anger. Split up and search the area, the leader commanded. James's heart sank. They were splitting up. This made it harder for them to stay hidden. They could find us any second, Emma whispered, trembling beside him. Just then, a loud crash echoed through the park as one of the men knocked over a trash can, causing garbage to spill everywhere. "Stop messing around," the leader shouted. "Find them." James felt a surge of fear as he glanced around, searching for a way to escape. Suddenly, he spotted a small building near the edge of the park, partially hidden by the trees. "There, let's go." He grabbed Emma's hand, and they darted toward the building, their hearts pounding as they slipped inside, just as the men shouted again. The inside of the building was dark and dusty, but it provided them a moment of shelter. "Do you think they saw us?" Emma asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," James replied, listening for any signs of their pursuers. Just then, they heard footsteps approaching outside the door, and James felt his heart race. "Stay quiet," he whispered urgently, pressing Emma against the wall. The footsteps stopped just outside, and they held their breath, waiting to see what would happen. Suddenly, the door creaked open, and James's heart dropped. "Search this place," the leader commanded, stepping inside. James could barely breathe as he pressed Emma against the wall, trying to keep them both hidden. The men began to search the room, opening cabinets and looking behind boxes. "Where are they?" One of them grunted in frustration. "Maybe they went out the back," the leader said, moving toward the other side of the room. James's heart raced as he realized they had to act fast. "Now," he whispered to Emma, taking a deep breath. They darted out the door, slipping past the men as quietly as they could. Once outside, they took off running, racing toward the edge of the park. "Where do we go now?" Emma cried, her face filled with panic. "Anywhere but here," James shouted, glancing back at the building. Just then, they heard shouting behind them as the men burst out of the building, their voices echoing in the night. "Get them!" the leader yelled. James and Emma sprinted down the street, their hearts pounding as they ran for their lives. They dashed through the neighborhood, their legs aching and lungs burning as they pushed themselves to keep going. "Where can we hide?" Emma gasped, glancing back at their pursuers. "There." James pointed to a small alleyway that led to a row of garages. They ducked into the alley, their hearts racing as they pressed against the wall, trying to catch their breath. But as they stood there, James felt a sense of dread wash over him. The men were getting closer, their voices echoing through the alley. "Let's split up," the leader shouted. "They can't be far." James's heart dropped. They were splitting up again, and they wouldn't know which way to run. "Don't move," he whispered to Emma, pressing his back against the wall. Just then, they heard footsteps approaching their hiding spot, and James held his breath, praying they wouldn't be found. The footsteps stopped, and James could feel his heart pounding in his chest. But instead of turning back, one of the men moved closer, peering into the shadows. "There's got to be someone here," he shouted, his voice filled with determination. Just then, the man reached for the corner of the wall, and James felt a surge of fear. "Run," he shouted to Emma, pulling her away as they dashed deeper into the alley. They raced down the narrow path, their hearts pounding as they searched for any sign of safety. As they turned the corner, they spotted an old garage door slightly ajar. "Inside," James urged, pulling Emma through the gap just as the man shouted behind them. They stumbled into the dark garage, their breaths heavy as they pressed against the wall, listening for any sign of their pursuers. "What do we do now?" Emma whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "We have to stay quiet and wait," James replied, feeling the adrenaline rush through him. But just as they settled into their hiding spot, the door creaked open, and a familiar face stepped inside. "Sarah, are you guys okay?" she whispered urgently, her eyes scanning the room. "We're hiding from them," James said, feeling a surge of relief. "They were right behind us." Sarah nodded, her expression serious. "We need to come up with a new plan. They won't stop until they find us." James felt a rush of determination again. They couldn't let these men win. "What do we do?" he asked, his mind racing with possibilities. Sarah looked around the garage, her eyes thoughtful. "We need to set a bigger distraction, something that will draw them away from us for good." James nodded, feeling a spark of hope. "I can help." As they began to brainstorm ideas, They felt the weight of the night pressing down on them. But they were together, and together, they could fight against whatever was thrown their way. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed outside the garage, and James's heart sank. What was that? Emma gasped, her eyes wide with fear. I don't know, but we need to find out, Sarah said, her voice steady. They moved cautiously toward the door, peering out into the darkness. Just then, they heard the sound of footsteps approaching, and James felt a wave of panic wash over him. Quick, back, he whispered urgently, pulling Emma and Sarah away from the door. They pressed themselves against the wall, their hearts pounding as they waited for the footsteps to pass. But just as they thought they were safe, the door swung open, revealing the men, their faces twisted with anger. There they are, the leader shouted, pointing at them. James's heart raced as they prepared to fight, but before they could react, a loud siren blared through the night. Police, one of the men shouted, his eyes wide with fear. The gang members turned to flee, running in all directions as the sirens grew closer. James and Emma exchanged confused glances, unsure of what was happening. Is it over? Emma asked, her voice trembling. I don't know, James replied, feeling a mix of hope and uncertainty. As they stood in the garage, the sound of police cars approached, their lights flashing in the night. Just then, Sarah smiled, her eyes sparkling with determination. This isn't over yet. We need to make sure the necklace is safe. James nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. They couldn't let the treasure fall into the wrong hands, not now when they were so close to stopping the men for good. As the sounds of chaos erupted outside, they knew they had to act fast. Let's go, James urged, leading the way out of the garage. They stepped into the night, ready to face whatever lay ahead. The night air was filled with the distant wails of sirens and the sounds of chaos echoing through the park as James, Emma, and Sarah stepped cautiously out of the garage. The flickering lights of police cars illuminated the streets, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. Quick, we need to find the necklace before the men regroup, Sarah urged, her eyes darting around, searching for any sign of danger. James nodded, his heart racing. Let's go back to the oak tree. It's the best hiding spot for it. They took off running, their footsteps muffled by the soft grass beneath them. As they raced toward the oak tree, James could hear the faint shouts of the gang members nearby. They'll be looking for us, Emma panted, glancing over her shoulder. We can't let them find us, James replied, determination surging through him. If they get the necklace, we'll be in real trouble. They reached the tree, and James quickly pulled the necklace from the hollow trunk, holding it tightly in his hand. Now what? Emma asked, her voice filled with urgency. We have to hide it somewhere else, Sarah said, her brow furrowed in concentration. But we need to draw the gang away first. James looked around, spotting a small path leading deeper into the park. What if we use the path to create a diversion? We can make it seem like we're heading that way. That's a great idea, Sarah replied, her eyes lighting up. Emma looked hesitant. But what if they catch us? We'll be quick, James reassured her. We can do this together. They quickly made their way down the path, careful to keep their footsteps quiet. The sounds of the police sirens echoed behind them, creating a sense of urgency that drove them forward. As they reached a clearing, Sarah turned to them, her voice steady. We need to make some noise to draw them away. James, do you have anything we can use? James thought for a moment before reaching into his backpack. He pulled out a small rock and held it up. I can throw this into the bushes over there. It'll make a sound and distract them. Good thinking, Sarah said, nodding with approval. James took a deep breath, focusing on the bushes that lined the edge of the clearing. He threw the rock with all his might, and it landed with a loud thud in the underbrush. Let's move, Sarah shouted, leading the way as they dashed in the opposite direction. They ran deeper into the park, their hearts pounding as they heard the sound of footsteps approaching the noise. Over there, one of the gang members shouted, his voice filled with anger. They went this way. James glanced back, seeing the men breaking through the bushes. We have to hurry. Just then, they spotted a small building at the edge of the park, a weathered shed that looked like it hadn't been used in years. Let's hide in there, Emma suggested, pointing toward the shed. They dashed toward it, slipping inside just as the men entered the clearing. Inside the shed, Darkness enveloped them, and they pressed against the wall, trying to catch their breath. "Do you think they saw us?" Emma whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," James replied, straining to listen for any sign of the men. Outside, they could hear the gang members shouting, searching the area for any trace of them. "Split up," the leader ordered, his voice filled with frustration. "They can't have gone far." James felt a shiver run down his spine. The men were getting closer, and they had to find a way to escape. "Do you think they'll come in here?" Emma asked, her eyes wide with fear. "Probably," James replied, glancing around the shed. "We need to find a way out." He scanned the room, spotting a small window near the ceiling. "There, we can climb out that window." Sarah nodded, her eyes shining with determination. "I'll go first." She climbed onto a stack of old crates, reaching for the window. With a little effort, she managed to pull herself up and squeeze through. "Now you, James," Emma urged, her eyes filled with anxiety. James quickly followed, hoisting himself up onto the crates and pushing himself through the window, landing on the other side with a thud. "Be careful," Emma called as she climbed up behind him. Just as she was about to pull herself through, James heard the door creak open behind them. "Get them," the leader shouted, his voice echoing through the shed. "Emma, hurry," James urged, reaching back to help her through the window. Emma squeezed through just as the men charged into the shed, their angry shouts filling the air. "Go! Run!" Sarah shouted, leading the way as they took off into the dark. They sprinted across the park, their legs burning as they raced for safety. "Where do we go now?" Emma panted, glancing back toward the shed. "Let's head toward the playground," James suggested, spotting the familiar structure in the distance. "It's a good place to hide." They dashed toward the playground, ducking behind the swings as they caught their breath. "What's the plan now?" Sarah asked, her eyes scanning the area. James felt a rush of determination again. "We have to find a way to turn the tables on them. If we can trap them, we can keep the necklace safe." Sarah nodded, her expression serious. "But how? We need to be smart about this." Just then, they heard the sound of footsteps approaching, and James felt his heart race. "They're coming," Emma whispered, her voice filled with fear. James looked around, desperate for an idea. "We need to create a distraction again. Maybe we can use the playground equipment." "Good thinking," Sarah replied, her eyes lighting up. "If we can make it sound like we're on the other side, they'll have to check it out." They quickly moved to the other side of the playground, where the climbing frame loomed above them. James spotted a loose piece of wood lying on the ground. "I can throw this over there," he said, pointing toward a nearby bush. "Do it," Sarah urged. James threw the wood with all his strength, and it landed with a loud crash in the bushes. "Go, go, go," Sarah shouted, pushing them toward the slide. They ducked behind the slide, holding their breath as they listened for the men. "Did you hear that?" one of the gang members said, his voice filled with suspicion. "It came from over there," the leader shouted, pointing toward the noise. "Let's check it out." James felt a rush of excitement as the men moved away from their hiding spot. "Now's our chance," he whispered, motioning for them to follow. They slipped out from behind the slide, creeping silently toward the other side of the playground. As they reached the edge, they spotted the men searching the bushes, their faces twisted with anger and frustration. "Where are they?" one of them growled, kicking at the leaves. "They can't have gotten far," the leader shouted, his voice echoing in the night. "Let's split up again." James felt a knot of fear in his stomach. They were still searching for them, and they needed to be careful. "Quick, back to the trees," Sarah whispered, leading the way. They raced toward the trees, their hearts pounding as they sought shelter once more. Just as they reached the cover of the branches, they heard a loud crash behind them. "What was that?" Emma gasped, her eyes wide with fear. James glanced back, seeing one of the gang members had stumbled over a fallen branch, and now he was yelling for the others. "They're going to find us," Emma cried, panic rising in her voice. "Not if we can help it," James said, taking a deep breath. "We have to stay calm and think." They ducked behind a large tree, holding their breath as they listened to the men's angry shouts growing closer. "Check the trees. They can't hide forever." James felt his heart race as he looked at Sarah. "We need to split up. It might confuse them." Sarah nodded, her expression serious. We'll meet back at the oak tree. James felt a surge of fear, but he knew it was their best chance. Okay, let's do it. They each took off in different directions, James sprinting deeper into the woods as he tried to stay low. The sounds of the gang searching filled the air, their angry voices echoing around him. Where did they go? One of the men shouted. James pressed himself against a tree, trying to quiet his breathing. He could hear footsteps approaching, and his heart raced. Just then, he spotted a familiar flash of light cutting through the darkness. The police were closing in. He could hear their voices shouting in the distance, their flashlights flickering like stars among the trees. Over here, James called out, hoping Sarah and Emma could hear him. But as he turned to make his way back toward the oak tree, he heard the familiar voice of the leader shout from nearby. Don't let them escape. James's heart sank as he realized the gang was moving closer. He had to warn the girls. Just as he was about to run, he heard a loud scream pierce the night. Emma, James shouted, feeling panic rise within him. He turned to race toward the sound, his heart pounding in his chest. James sprinted through the dark woods, his heart thundering in his chest. Emma's scream still echoed in his mind, each step he took driven by the terror of what might have happened. The branches scratched his arms as he pushed through the underbrush, but he didn't care. He had to find her. Emma, he called, his voice straining in the thick night air. Emma, where are you? Silence answered him. He paused, his breathing heavy, straining to hear any sound that could lead him to her. The woods were eerily still, with only the distant rustling of leaves to accompany him. The flashlight beams of the police officers flickered in the distance, their presence comforting but too far away to help now. Just then, a faint rustle came from nearby. James's heart leaped in his chest. Emma, he whispered, creeping toward the sound. Suddenly, a figure burst from the shadows, and James nearly screamed in fright. But as the figure stumbled into the moonlight, he saw Sarah's face, wide-eyed and panicked. James, she gasped, out of breath. I heard her scream too. Where is she? I don't know, James replied, his voice shaky. We have to find her. Sarah nodded, her eyes scanning the darkness around them. She can't be far. Let's keep moving. They hurried together through the woods, every rustle of the leaves and snap of a twig setting them on edge. The fear that something terrible had happened to Emma gnawed at James's insides. Just then, they heard it. A muffled voice, faint but unmistakable. Help. James. That's her, James shouted, breaking into a run. Emma, we're coming. They followed the sound, racing through the trees until they reached a small clearing. There, under the twisted branches of an ancient oak, was Emma. She was lying on the ground, her ankle twisted awkwardly beneath her, her face pale with pain. Emma, James cried, rushing to her side. Are you okay? What happened? I tripped, she whispered, wincing as she tried to move. I was running, and I didn't see the root. My ankle. I think it's sprained. James's heart ached as he saw the pain in her eyes. We'll get you out of here. Don't worry. But before they could move, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the clearing. James froze, his heart pounding as he recognized the angry voices of the gang members approaching fast. They're here, Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with fear. We have to move. But Emma can't walk, James said, panic rising in his throat. We'll have to carry her, Sarah replied, her voice filled with urgency. Come on, help me lift her. James and Sarah carefully lifted Emma, supporting her between them as they staggered toward the edge of the clearing. Emma bit her lip, trying to hold back the pain as they moved as quickly as they could. The gang was close now, too close. Where are they? One of the men shouted, his voice filled with frustration. They can't be far. The leader snarled. Keep searching. James's heart pounded in his chest. They were out of time. If the gang found them now, they wouldn't stand a chance. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the clearing, followed by a bright light that cut through the trees. James turned, his eyes widening in shock as a police car barreled into the clearing, its headlights illuminating the gang members who had been closing in on them. Freeze! An officer shouted, stepping out of the car with his gun drawn, hands in the air. The gang members hesitated for a moment, their faces contorted with rage. But as more police cars pulled up, sirens blaring, they realized they were outnumbered. One by one, they raised their hands in surrender, their eyes glaring with hatred. James let out a shaky breath, relief washing over him like a wave. They were safe. The police had arrived just in time. "Thank goodness," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. As the officers moved in to arrest the gang members, James and Sarah carefully helped Emma to the police car. One of the officers, a kind-looking man with graying hair, approached them, his flashlight casting long shadows on the ground. "You kids okay?" he asked, his voice gentle. "We're fine," James replied, his voice thick with exhaustion. But Emma hurt her ankle. The officer nodded, looking concerned. "We'll get her some help. You did a good job out here." James felt a surge of pride, but his mind was still racing. There was one thing left to deal with. "The necklace," he said suddenly, turning to Sarah. "We still have it." Sarah's eyes widened as she reached into her pocket, pulling out the glittering necklace. It shimmered in the moonlight, its beauty undeniable. "We can't let it fall into the wrong hands," Sarah whispered. "But what do we do with it now?" James thought for a moment, his mind racing. The gang had been after this necklace from the beginning, and now that they were in police custody, it seemed like the immediate danger was over. But something still didn't sit right with him. Before he could answer, a new voice interrupted them. "Excuse me," a woman said, stepping out from behind one of the police cars. She was tall and elegant, with sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "I believe that necklace belongs to me." James blinked in surprise. Who are you?" The woman smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. "My name is Victoria Lancaster. That necklace was stolen from my family years ago." Sarah and James exchanged glances. Something about this woman felt off. "How do we know it's really yours?" Sarah asked, her voice firm. Victoria's smile widened, but her eyes remained cold. "I have the proof, and I'll be taking it now." James's stomach churned with unease. Something wasn't right here. Just then, another loud crash echoed in the distance, and before they could react, the ground beneath them began to shake. The ground trembled violently beneath James, Sarah, and Emma's feet, sending a shockwave of panic through them. James instinctively reached out to steady Emma as the shaking intensified, his heart hammering in his chest. "What's happening?" Emma cried, gripping James's arm tightly, her voice filled with fear. "I don't know," James shouted, his voice barely audible over the rumble of the earth. Victoria Lancaster, the strange woman who claimed the necklace, stumbled slightly but remained composed. Her sharp eyes were locked on the necklace in Sarah's hand, her lips curling into a smile that sent chills down James's spine. "Give it to me," Victoria demanded, her voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. "Now." Sarah took a step back, clutching the necklace tightly to her chest. "No, something's not right. How do we know you're telling the truth?" Before Victoria could respond, the ground beneath them gave another violent shake, and a deep crack split the earth just a few feet away from where they stood. It was as if the earth itself was coming apart. "Run," James shouted, pulling Emma away from the widening fissure. He could hear the shouts of the police officers as they scrambled to maintain order, but their voices were drowned out by the rumbling beneath their feet. Victoria's smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold fury. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," she hissed, her eyes narrowing. "That necklace is mine. Hand it over, or you'll regret it." James's heart raced. He didn't trust this woman. Everything about her felt wrong, from the way she appeared so suddenly to her unsettling demeanor. But more than that, he could sense that the necklace was somehow connected to whatever was happening around them. The ground, the trembling. It all started after they retrieved it. Sarah's hand shook as she held the necklace tightly, her knuckles white. "I'm not giving it to you," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "This necklace is dangerous. I can feel it." Victoria's eyes darkened, and she took a step forward, her presence seeming to grow larger, more ominous. "You foolish children. You don't know what kind of power you're playing with. Hand it over, or the consequences will be beyond anything you can imagine." James's mind raced as he tried to think of a way out. They couldn't let this woman take the necklace, but the ground beneath them was growing more unstable by the second, and Emma was hurt. They were running out of time. Suddenly, the police officer who had helped them earlier approached, his expression serious. What's going on here? We need to get you kids to safety. His gaze shifted to Victoria. And who are you, ma'am? Victoria straightened, her cold eyes narrowing at the officer. I'm the rightful owner of that necklace, she said smoothly, her voice laced with venom. These children are holding it against my will. The officer looked confused, glancing between the kids and Victoria. Is that true? He asked, his brow furrowed. No, James said quickly. She's lying. We found the necklace, but she just showed up out of nowhere, claiming it's hers. The officer's eyes shifted to the necklace in Sarah's hand. His expression darkened, as if something about the situation didn't sit right with him either. I think we need to sort this out back at the station. No one's taking anything right now. Victoria's face twisted with rage, but she didn't move. Instead, she smiled coldly, her gaze locked on the officer. You don't understand what's at stake here, do you? Before the officer could respond, the ground beneath them shook again. This time harder, more violent. The crack in the earth widened, sending a loud, thunderous boom through the clearing. The police cars rocked as the officers shouted for people to move away, the entire park trembling like it was being torn apart. James stumbled backward, barely managing to keep his balance as the fissure snaked toward them. The earth groaned, and a piece of the ground collapsed into the abyss, sending chunks of dirt and stone tumbling into the darkness below. Get back, the officer yelled, grabbing James by the arm and pulling him away from the edge of the growing chasm. We need to get out of here. But just as they turned to flee, Victoria made her move. With a swift motion, she lunged toward Sarah, her hand reaching for the necklace. Sarah cried out, stumbling backward, but Victoria was fast, too fast. Her fingers grazed the chain, and for a moment, it seemed like she would snatch it from Sarah's grasp. But then, something strange happened. The necklace, shimmering in the moonlight, glowed faintly. A strange, pulsing light emanated from the jewels, and the air around them seemed to hum with energy. Victoria's hand froze, inches from the necklace, her eyes wide with shock. What? She gasped, her voice filled with disbelief. James stared in awe as the light grew brighter, casting an eerie glow over the clearing. It wasn't just a necklace. It was something much more powerful, something ancient, something alive. Victoria recoiled, her face twisted with a mixture of fear and anger. No, this can't be happening, she screamed, her voice echoing through the clearing. The ground beneath them trembled again, and James felt a sudden rush of cold air sweep through the trees. The necklace pulsed with light, brighter and brighter, until it was almost blinding. We have to go, Sarah shouted, her voice filled with panic. James didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed Emma's arm, pulling her to her feet as best he could, while Sarah clutched the necklace tightly. They ran as fast as they could, the ground shaking beneath them, the strange glow of the necklace lighting their way. Behind them, Victoria screamed in fury, but her voice was drowned out by the roar of the earth splitting open. As they raced toward the edge of the park, James's mind whirled with questions. What was that necklace? Why did it glow like that? And what had just happened with Victoria? They didn't have answers. But one thing was clear, this wasn't over. They'd reached the edge of the park, the police cars and flashing lights still visible in the distance. The officers were busy managing the situation, their attention focused on the chaos in the clearing. For now, they were safe. But as James looked back at the glowing necklace in Sarah's hand, he knew their journey was far from finished. Whatever this necklace was, it held a power beyond anything they had imagined. And someone, maybe more than one person, was willing to do anything to get it. What now? Emma whispered, her voice trembling with fear. James stared at the glowing necklace, his heart racing. I don't know, he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. But we need to figure out what this thing is, before it's too late. James, Sarah, and Emma huddled beneath a large oak tree at the edge of the park, catching their breath. The chaotic scene they had just escaped seemed like a distant memory, even though they could still hear the faint sounds of police sirens and see flashing lights through the trees. But their attention was locked on one thing, the glowing necklace in Sarah's hand. What do we do now? Emma asked, her voice trembling as she sat with her injured ankle stretched out. James shook his head, running his hand through his hair. I don't know. This thing, it's not just a necklace. It's something way more dangerous. Sarah, still holding the necklace, nodded. It felt like, I don't know, like it was alive or something. She turned the necklace in her hands, the glowing jewels pulsing faintly with light. But why did it do that when Victoria tried to take it? James's brow furrowed. Maybe it's some kind of protection, like it knew she wasn't supposed to have it. That sounds crazy, Emma muttered. But after everything we've seen, I'm not sure what's crazy anymore. They fell silent for a moment, the weight of the situation sinking in. The necklace was no ordinary piece of jewelry. It had a power none of them understood. And now it seemed like they were caught in something far bigger than they could have imagined. Who is Victoria, anyway? James asked, breaking the silence. She shows up out of nowhere, claims the necklace is hers. And then all of that happens. Sarah shook her head, her eyes narrowing. I don't trust her. She didn't seem scared when the ground was shaking, or when the necklace started glowing. She seemed angry. James nodded. Yeah, and she knew about the necklace. Like she knew what it could do. A chill ran down his spine as he thought about Victoria's cold eyes and the strange way she had reacted when the necklace glowed. Whoever she wasn't just an ordinary person. And James was sure of one thing. Victoria was dangerous. We need to figure out what this thing is before she comes after us again, James said, his voice firm. There has to be something, some clue about what it is. Sarah bit her lip, staring at the necklace. We could try looking online, see if there's any information about it. Yeah, maybe, James replied, though he wasn't convinced. This wasn't the kind of thing you'd find on a random website, but it was a start. Just then, the faint sound of footsteps approached, and all three of them froze. James's heart leaped into his throat as he strained to see through the darkness. Who's there? He called out, his voice tight with fear. For a moment, there was no answer. Then, a familiar voice spoke softly from the shadows. It's me, Officer Harrison. James relaxed slightly as the police officer stepped into view, his flashlight casting a soft glow over them. Harrison was the same officer who had helped them earlier, the one who had stood up to Victoria. Are you kids okay? Officer Harrison asked, his voice calm but concerned. The ground split open back there. We're trying to get everyone to safety. We're fine, James said quickly, but he couldn't hide the tension in his voice. But that woman, Victoria, she tried to take the necklace from us. Officer Harrison frowned, kneeling beside them. Victoria, the woman from earlier. Sarah nodded, holding the necklace out for him to see. She said it was hers, but we didn't believe her. And then, this happened. Officer Harrison's eyes widened as he took in the glowing necklace. He hesitated for a moment, then looked at them seriously. You're right not to trust her. James blinked in surprise. What do you mean? Harrison sighed, glancing over his shoulder to make sure no one else was nearby. I've been working on a case that involves artifacts like this. Strange objects, things that shouldn't exist but do. There's a lot of mystery surrounding them, and people like Victoria. They'll do anything to get their hands on them. James's heart raced. So this necklace, it's one of those artifacts. Harrison nodded slowly. I believe so. And if that's true, it's incredibly dangerous. These artifacts, some of them have powers we don't fully understand. Powers that can change the world in ways we can't control. Emma gasped softly, her eyes wide. But why would someone want that? Why would Victoria want it? Harrison's face grew grim. Power, wealth, control. People like her, they don't care about the consequences, only what they can gain. James swallowed hard, the gravity of the situation sinking in. So, what do we do now? If she's after it, she won't stop until she gets it. Harrison stood up, glancing around the park. You're right. She won't. But there's a way to stop her. How? Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly. There's someone I know, Harrison said quietly, an expert on these artifacts. He's been studying them for years, trying to understand their origins and how to neutralize their powers. If anyone can help you figure out what this necklace is and how to keep it safe, it's him. James's mind raced. An expert. That sounded like exactly what they needed, but something about the way Harrison spoke made him uneasy. Why haven't you told the other officers about this? James asked carefully. Harrison's eyes darkened. Because not everyone can be trusted. Some people in positions of power, they're involved in this too. They'd rather see these artifacts in the wrong hands than destroyed. If Victoria's working for someone bigger, we can't trust anyone but ourselves. James's throat tightened. This was even more complicated than he'd thought. So, where do we find this expert? Sarah asked, glancing nervously at the necklace. Harrison hesitated, then pulled out a small card from his pocket. His name is Dr. Elias Carrington. He's a historian and researcher. He lives off the grid, doesn't want to be found easily, for obvious reasons, but this address should lead you to him. James took the card, his hands shaking slightly. The address was scribbled in neat handwriting, along with a phone number. It was in a town a few hours away, deep in the countryside. You need to go to him as soon as possible, Harrison urged. If Victoria's after you, it's only a matter of time before she tracks you down. James nodded, his mind whirling with the weight of the task ahead of them. We'll go, first thing in the morning. Harrison gave them a firm look. Be careful. And keep that necklace hidden. Don't trust anyone. With that, Officer Harrison gave them one last nod before disappearing into the darkness, leaving the three friends alone once more. The park was quiet now, the ground still, and the night air heavy with the sense of impending danger. We have to go see this Dr. Carrington, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. If there's any chance he can help us, we have to take it. James agreed, though his stomach was tied in knots. This was bigger than anything they'd ever faced before. But now, they had no choice but to keep going. Emma, pale and still in pain from her ankle, gave them a weak smile. I guess we're not done with this adventure yet, huh? James forced a smile, though his heart felt heavy with worry. Not yet. As they made their way back toward town, the glowing necklace hidden in Sarah's bag, James couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The wind howled as James, Sarah, and Emma stood in front of the old, dilapidated house deep in the woods. It was far from any town, miles away from the nearest road. The address Officer Harrison had given them led them here, to the home of Dr. Elias Carrington, the man who might hold the key to understanding the necklace's power and how to stop Victoria Lancaster. The house loomed over them, its weathered wooden boards creaking in the wind, its windows dark and uninviting. It was the kind of place that would make anyone hesitate to step inside, but they had come too far to turn back now. Are you sure this is the place? Emma asked, her voice barely audible over the wind. James nodded, though doubt gnawed at him. This is the address Harrison gave us. It has to be. With a deep breath, Sarah knocked on the door. They waited, the silence of the forest around them eerie and unnerving. For a moment, James wondered if no one was home, if this was all just another dead end. But then, the door creaked open, revealing a tall, gaunt man with a shock of white hair and sharp, piercing eyes. He looked every bit the eccentric historian they had imagined. Dr. Carrington, James asked, his voice trembling slightly. The man's eyes flickered with recognition as he glanced at the trio, and then down at Sarah, who was clutching her bag tightly. His gaze lingered there for a moment before he nodded slowly. You've brought it with you, haven't you? Sarah swallowed, reaching into her bag to pull out the necklace. The moment it was in view, Dr. Carrington's face darkened with a mix of awe and fear. You have no idea what you're carrying, he said softly, stepping aside to let them in. Come inside, quickly. They stepped into the dimly lit house, which smelled of old books and dust. The walls were lined with shelves filled with ancient texts, artifacts, and strange objects from all over the world. It felt like stepping into another time, another world entirely. Dr. Carrington led them into a small study, where a fire crackled weakly in the hearth. He gestured for them to sit down, and then turned his full attention to the necklace. That, he said, pointing at the glowing jewels, is the heart of Arian. It's not just an artifact. It's a key to a very dangerous and ancient power that has been locked away for centuries. James felt a chill run down his spine. What kind of power? Carrington sat down, his eyes grave. A power that could reshape the world as we know it. The heart of Arian was created by an ancient civilization that believed in harnessing the forces of nature and time itself. The necklace was a conduit for that power, and whoever controls it, controls everything. Sarah's hands trembled as she held the necklace. But why is it glowing? Why did it react to Victoria? Carrington's face hardened. Because the heart recognizes those who seek to use it for evil. Victoria Lancaster is part of a secret order that has been hunting the heart for generations. They believe that by unlocking its full potential, they can control time and bend the world to their will. That's why she's after you. James exchanged a look with Sarah and Emma. Everything was falling into place. The strange occurrences, the earthquakes, the way the necklace had protected them. Victoria wanted to use the necklace for her own twisted ambitions. Is there any way to stop her? James asked urgently. How do we destroy the necklace? Carrington's expression softened slightly. Destroying the heart is nearly impossible. But there is a way to render it powerless. The heart was designed to be dormant until all the pieces of its power were united. There's a hidden temple, far from here, where the heart can be returned to its resting place. Once there, its power will be sealed forever. A temple, Sarah repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, Carrington replied. An ancient sanctuary where the heart was kept safe for centuries. It was hidden from the world, forgotten by time. Until now. James's mind raced. The necklace, the earthquakes, the strange power Victoria sought. It all made sense. The heart of Arian wasn't meant to be worn or used. It was meant to be sealed away, its power locked forever. But if Victoria got her hands on it before they could return it to the temple, everything would be lost. Where is this temple? James asked, determined. Carrington stood, walking over to a map on the wall. He pointed to a remote mountain range far to the north. It's here, in the ancient ruins of Arian, but it won't be easy to reach. The journey is perilous, and Victoria won't stop hunting you. We don't have a choice, Sarah said, her voice firm. We have to get there before she does. Carrington nodded. Then you must leave immediately. Every moment you waste, she gets closer. I'll help you as much as I can, but the path is yours to walk. Just as James was about to respond, the sound of a car screeching to a halt outside made his heart skip a beat. Footsteps pounded against the gravel, and then a loud bang echoed through the house. The front door had been forced open. She's here, Emma whispered, her face pale. Carrington's eyes widened. Go. Take the back exit and run. I'll hold her off as long as I can. Without hesitation, James grabbed the necklace from Sarah's hand and stuffed it into his jacket. The three of them bolted for the back door, Carrington ushering them through a narrow hallway. As they reached the exit, they heard Victoria's voice, cold and venomous, echoing through the house. Where are they, Carrington? The old man turned to them, his face solemn. Go, and don't stop until you reach the temple. James, Sarah, and Emma sprinted into the forest, their hearts pounding with fear and adrenaline. Behind them, they heard the crash of furniture, shouts, and the unmistakable sound of glass breaking. Victoria was close, too close. They ran through the woods, their breath coming in ragged gasps, the glowing necklace a heavy weight in James's pocket. The forest seemed endless, the shadows stretching out before them, but they kept going, driven by the knowledge that if they failed, the world as they knew it would never be the same. After what felt like hours, they finally reached a clearing, the sound of the house far behind them. They collapsed onto the grass, their bodies aching, but they knew they couldn't rest. What now? Emma panted, clutching her side. James pulled out the necklace, staring at it in the dim moonlight. Now, we find that temple. Weeks later, high in the mountains of the ancient Aryan ruins, James, Sarah, and Emma stood before the entrance to a temple that had been hidden for centuries. The wind whipped around them, and the air was heavy with a sense of finality. They had survived the journey, barely. Victoria had chased them relentlessly, her anger growing with each failed attempt to capture the heart of Arian. But in the end, they had reached the temple first. As they stepped inside the dark sanctuary, the necklace began to glow once more, illuminating the ancient carvings on the walls. It felt right, like the necklace was home. James, with a deep breath, approached the altar at the center of the room. With trembling hands, he placed the necklace down, watching as its light slowly faded until it was nothing more than a dull glimmer. The heart of Arian had been returned to its resting place, its power sealed forever. As they turned to leave the temple, the weight of their journey lifted from their shoulders. The world was safe, at least for now. But as they stepped out into the light of the setting sun, James couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't truly the end. Somewhere, in the shadows, Victoria Lancaster was still out there, waiting for her chance to strike again.